We are getting some breaking news in the investigation into the disappearance of Nancy Guthrie. Before anything else, subscribe right now because in this video, we are answering the one question that has haunted this case. 63 days since Nancy Guthrie mysteriously vanished from her home in her pajamas without the crucial medication that she needs. One source is now sounding the alarm on the investigators' lack of experience. That shortfall possibly having a negative impact in the early but most critical moments of the investigation. In fact, the supervisor who first arrived to Nancy Guthrie's home apparently had never investigated a homicide before. My question would be, were you interested in preserving her life at all? Okay, we know there's blood on the porch. We know the door is propped open. We know that she separated from her pacemaker at approximately 2:28 in the morning. The offender or offenders did not choose to take NY's health-related items that she would have needed to have survived. Visor, who first responded to Nancy Guthrie's house, had never investigated a homicide. The first thing investigators focused on was not what happened inside Nancy Guthrie's home. It was what happened before anyone even realized something was wrong. February 1st, 2026. Tucson, Arizona, Catalina foothills. An 84-year-old woman disappears from a home she had lived in for years. No forced entry, no broken windows, no signs of a rush struggle, just absence. And the last confirmed person to see her alive was someone she trusted, her own son-in-law. That detail alone would have placed him inside the investigation. But what followed in the days after her disappearance is what made his name impossible to ignore. Because while search teams were moving through desert terrain, while helicopters scanned open land, and while her family stood in front of cameras asking for help, he said nothing. Not publicly, not emotionally, not even in the way people expect when someone close to them vanishes. That silence became part of the case. Not evidence, not proof, but something investigators could not dismiss. Because in missing person investigations, behavior matters. And Tommaso Chion's behavior stood apart from everyone else connected to Nancy Guthrie. To understand why his name became central so quickly, investigators had to reconstruct the final confirmed timeline. Not the rumors, not the speculation, just the facts. Nancy Guthrie had spent the evening at her daughter Annie's home. It was a routine visit, dinner, conversation, a few hours together that by all accounts felt completely normal. There were no reported arguments, no signs of tension visible to anyone outside that house. At some point later that night, Tommaso drove her home. That part is not disputed. He arrived at her residence in Catalina foothills, a quiet established neighborhood where unusual activity tends to stand out. According to official statements, he waited long enough to see her enter safely. He saw the garage door open. He saw her go inside and then he left. That moment became the last confirmed visual confirmation of Nancy Guthrie alive. Everything after that disappears into uncertainty. But investigators don't work with uncertainty. They work with timelines. So, they began narrowing the window. NY's doorbell camera went offline at approximately 1:47 a.m. Her pacemaker, a device that continuously logs cardiac activity, transmitted its last signal at approximately 2:28 a.m. That gap became critical because it meant something happened inside that house during that window of time. Something significant enough to interrupt both digital systems and a human body. When investigators entered the home, they were not looking for something obvious. They were looking for consistency. Does the scene match what a normal night should look like? In this case, it didn't. There were no clear signs of forced entry. That immediately narrowed possibilities because in most residential crimes involving intrusion, entry points leave traces. Locks show stress, frames crack, glass breaks. None of that was present, which introduces a different category of access: voluntary entry or familiarity. Then came the cameras. The system had not simply failed, it had been accessed remotely using the correct credentials. That detail changed the direction of the investigation almost immediately because it meant whoever interacted with that system did not guess their way in. They knew how, they knew what to do, and more importantly, they knew when to do it. This is where investigators begin asking a different type of question. Not who could break in, but who already belonged there. At the same time outside the home, another layer of the investigation was unfolding. The vehicle, the same vehicle used to drive Nancy home that night. Law enforcement seized it early, not because it proved anything on its own, but because it was the last controlled environment connected to her movement. Vehicles hold data, fibers, trace evidence, biological material, transfer patterns, and sometimes they reveal timelines that people cannot. Around this time, media coverage began accelerating, and with that came a turning point, a public claim. Journalist Ashley Banfield reported that law enforcement sources were already considering Tomasian as a potential central figure in the case. Not charged, not confirmed, but being discussed internally. That distinction matters because early investigative theories are often fluid. But once a name enters the public space, perception shifts, and in this case, it shifted fast. Images surfaced shortly after. Photos of Tommaso and Annie leaving their home. He covered part of his face. She avoided direct visibility. Individually, those actions can be explained in many ways. Privacy, stress, media pressure, but collectively they contributed to something investigators are always aware of: pattern perception. And the public began forming one. Meanwhile, law enforcement moved in a different direction. Quietly, methodically, search warrants were executed, the home was processed, devices were collected, statements were taken, and one by one, the initial investigative steps were completed. Then something unexpected happened. Authorities publicly stated that the family had been cleared, not partially, not tentatively, cleared through interviews, evidence review, and forensic comparison, including DNA. That announcement should have shifted the narrative, but it didn't fully because once a question takes hold publicly, it doesn't disappear easily. At this point, the investigation split into two directions: the public narrative and the actual investigative work, and those two are rarely aligned. Behind the scenes, forensic teams were working through something far more complex than a simple identification process. DNA had been recovered from the scene, but it wasn't clean. It was mixed, which means multiple contributors, and that creates a different challenge entirely, because isolating a usable profile from a mixed sample is not immediate. It requires time, software, and sometimes reconstruction techniques that are still evolving. This is where cases slow down, not because nothing is happening, but because the work shifts from visible action to analytical precision. At the same time, another unit was building something else entirely: cellular mapping. Every phone that connected to nearby towers during the relevant time window becomes part of a larger dataset. Not suspects, not targets, just data points. From there, patterns are built: movement paths, duration of presence, repeated appearances, and anomalies. And that's where something began to stand out. Not one single device, but behavioral patterns. Devices that appeared more than once. Devices that were present before the night Nancy disappeared, because investigators weren't just focused on February 1st, they were looking at January 11th, January 24th. Dates that had been flagged early, long before the public understood why. That introduces a different kind of theory. Not spontaneous, not random, but pre-incident activity which changes how a case is approached. Because if someone was present before the event, then the event itself may have been planned. At this stage, investigators were no longer asking what happened that night. They were asking, when did this actually begin? And while all of this was happening in controlled environments, labs, data centers, forensic units, Nancy Guthrie's family was doing something very different. They were asking the public for help. They released a statement not focused on theories, not focused on suspects, but focused on time, specific windows. January 11th, January 31st, February 1st. They asked people to check cameras, to revisit memories, to look at details they might have dismissed at the time. Because in cases like this, information doesn't always come from direct witnesses. Sometimes it comes from someone who saw something that didn't seem important until it was, and that's where this case remains. At the intersection of data and memory, evidence and absence, known timelines and missing pieces. Because even with everything that has been collected so far, there is still one question that has not been answered. Not publicly, not definitively. Where is Nancy Guthrie? And that question is what continues to drive everything forward. Not the speculation, not the headlines, but the fact that somewhere between 1:47 a.m. and 2:28 a.m., something happened inside that house. Something that has left behind traces but not yet a conclusion. The same question that has been there from the beginning. Where is Nancy Guthrie? Because until that is answered, everything else remains part of an unfinished story. Before this ends, there is something more important than any analysis. If you have any information at all, no matter how small it seems, this is the moment to come forward. Call the FBI. 1-800-CALL-FBI 1-800-225-55324. Submit a tip. https://tips.fbi.gov. Reward $11,000 total $1 million from the family plus $1,000 from the FBI. You can remain completely anonymous. You do not need to be certain. You do not need to have proof. Investigators build the case. You provide the detail. Because in cases like this, one detail can change everything. Nancy Guthrie is not a headline. She is a person. And this case is not over. Not until she is found. And until that happens, the investigation continues. By the time investigators returned to the Catalina foothills for a second round of questioning, the case had already changed. Not publicly, not in the headlines, but inside the investigation itself. Because early investigations are wide, they move in every direction at once. They follow every tip. They test every possibility. But at some point, that changes. The investigation begins to narrow. And when that happens, It is not because there are fewer leads, it is because some leads have started to matter more than others. That is where this case moved next. Back to the neighborhood, not to ask general questions, not to knock on doors randomly, but to focus. Residents described something unusual about that second round of visits. Federal agents were not asking broad questions, they were asking for names, specific names. Not did you see anything? Not did anything seem unusual. They were asking who was here, who worked here, who had access to this area. That level of specificity tells you something critical. Investigators were no longer trying to understand what happened. They were trying to identify who had the ability to make it happen. And that brings the case into a completely different phase. Because ability is not random. It is built through access, through familiarity, through time. That is why the focus shifted toward two very specific categories of presence: a nearby rental property and construction activity in the same area. At first glance, those two things seem unrelated, but operationally they share something important. They both provide a reason to be there, a legitimate reason. And that matters in a neighborhood like Catalina Foothills. Because in a place where residents notice everything, the only way to go unnoticed is to belong, or at least appear to belong. A rented home provides that. You live there, you move in and out, you are part of the environment. No one questions your presence. Construction work provides it too. Vehicles come and go, people move around properties. There is activity at different hours, and none of it stands out. That is what investigators were looking at. Not just who could have done this, but who could have done it without drawing attention. Now take that idea and bring it back to the timeline. January 11th. That date matters because it is not speculation. It is documented. A masked individual appears at NY's front door, not forcing entry, not attempting to break in, just present. That detail has been described by experienced investigators in a very specific way. A test, not an attempt. Because in planned operations, you do not begin with the event. You begin with observation. You study the environment. You study the timing. You study the response. You learn what happens when you do something small. And that is what January 11th represents. A small action with a larger purpose. Now move forward. January 24th. Another date that investigators have pointed to. Not publicly explained, but important enough for the family to ask the public to focus on it. Which tells you something. There is a pattern. Not a single event. Multiple points. And when multiple points appear before an incident, they form a sequence preparation. That is what investigators are working through, because if this was prepared, then February 1st was not the beginning. It was the execution, and that changes how every piece of evidence is understood. Now return to the property, the rental near NY's home. There are two competing timelines surrounding it. One version suggests the occupants left before the incident. The other suggests they left immediately after. Both versions cannot be true, but both versions point to the same question. Why does that property matter? Because whether it was empty before or vacated immediately after, it creates a window where accountability disappears. No one watching, no one reporting, no one noticing activity that should not be there. That is what investigators were trying to resolve, and that is why they returned. Not to confirm what was already known, but to clarify what did not align. At the same time, forensic work was moving forward, and this is where the case becomes more technical. DNA had already been recovered, but not in a simple way. Mixed samples, more than one contributor, which creates a challenge because separating those profiles takes time, and until they are separated, they cannot be matched. But once they are, everything changes because DNA does not suggest, it places. And in a controlled environment like NY's home, placement matters because anyone whose DNA is found there must have a reason to be there. And if that reason cannot be explained, it becomes evidence. Now extend that idea. If a second location is involved and the same DNA appears there, it creates something even stronger. Connection not just to a scene, but to a sequence. That is what investigators are working toward. Not just identifying a person, but placing that person across multiple points in the timeline, because once that happens, the case becomes difficult to dispute. At the same time, digital analysis continues building its own structure. Cell tower data is not about tracking a single phone. It is about understanding patterns. Which devices were present, which devices moved, which devices changed behavior, and which devices appeared when they should not have? This is not instant. It requires filtering. Thousands of devices reduced to hundreds, hundreds reduced to dozens until what remains is manageable and meaningful. At this stage, investigators are no longer overwhelmed by data. They are guided by it, because patterns begin to repeat. Devices appearing on January 11th, devices appearing again on January 24th, devices present near the time of the event. That repetition matters because coincidence does not repeat consistently. And when something repeats, it becomes part of the structure. Now bring all of this together. A masked individual appears weeks before. A second key date emerges. A nearby property becomes relevant. Construction activity is examined. DNA is recovered but unresolved. Digital patterns begin to form individually. Each of these elements raises questions together. They begin to answer them, not completely, but enough to change direction. And that is where the investigation is now. Not searching everywhere, but focusing on very specific things, very specific people, very specific movements, very specific timelines. And when an investigation reaches that point, something important has already happened. It has moved past uncertainty into structure because now instead of asking what could have happened, investigators are asking what fits everything we know. And that question has fewer answers, which means the case is getting closer, not to speculation, but to resolution. And yet, even with all of this, one question remains unchanged. The same question that has been there from the beginning. Where is Nancy Guthrie? Because until that is answered, everything else remains part of a story that is still unfolding. By this point in the investigation, something important had already happened. Not publicly, not in a way that made headlines, but inside the case itself, the direction had changed. Because there is a moment in every investigation where everything stops expanding outward and begins to pull inward. That moment does not come from one discovery. It comes from alignment when multiple independent pieces of information start pointing toward the same conclusion. And in the Nancy Guthrie case, that alignment was beginning to form. Not perfectly, not completely, but clearly enough that investigators adjusted how they were working. They stopped asking broad questions and started testing specific ones. Now, to understand that shift, you have to go back to something that seems small at the beginning, the environment. Not just the house, the area around it, because investigators had already established something critical. Nancy Guthrie did not disappear from a chaotic situation. She disappeared from a controlled one. No forced entry, no widespread disturbance, no immediate signs of panic, which means whatever happened within limits. And when something happens within limits, it usually means the person responsible understood those limits beforehand. That brings us back to preparation, but not preparation in a general sense. Preparation tied to place. Because the more investigators looked at the surrounding area, the more they realized something. This was not just a house. It was part of a pattern. A neighborhood where visibility matters, where unfamiliar movement is noticed, where time and routine are consistent. And that kind of environment creates a problem for anyone trying to operate inside it unless they have a way around it. That is what investigators were trying to understand. How does someone move inside a place like this without being noticed? The answer is not speed. It is familiarity, or the appearance of it. That is why the investigation stayed focused on two things: the nearby rental and the construction presence, because both create something very specific. Permission. Not legal permission, but environmental permission. The ability to exist in that space without being questioned. Now, when you combine that with the timeline, something becomes clearer. January 11th, January 24th, February 1st, 3 points, not random, sequential, the first appearance, the second alignment, the final event. That is how investigators begin to think about it. Not as isolated incidents, but as steps. And steps imply intention because nothing about that sequence suggests improvisation. Improvisation is unpredictable. This was not the same environment, the same location, the same pattern of presence. That consistency is what changes everything. At the same time, something else began to stand out more clearly. Time itself. Not just the window, but how that window was used. From 1:47 a.m. to 2:28 a.m., 41 minutes. That is not a long time, but it is long enough if you know exactly what needs to be done. That is the key difference. Someone acting randomly would waste time. They would hesitate. They would create noise. None of that appears here. Instead, what investigators see is something else. Efficiency. A sequence that does not extend beyond the window, which suggests that whoever was involved did not need to figure things out in the moment. They already knew. That is where preparation becomes more than a theory. It becomes the most likely explanation. Now bring that back to digital evidence because digital evidence does something unique. It records behavior without interpretation. Cell tower data does not guess. It logs. And what investigators were seeing in that data was not just presence, it was pattern. Devices appearing on earlier dates, devices aligning with movement, devices disappearing during critical moments. That last part matters the most because disappearance in data is not absence. It is interruption. And interruption is a decision. Phones do not simply vanish from networks without reason. They are turned off. They lose connection intentionally, or they move outside expected patterns. Each of those possibilities matters, and when multiple devices show similar interruptions, it becomes significant not as proof, but as structure. Now combine that with movement. Devices that were present near NY's home then moved outward, not randomly, in a direction, and that direction had already been identified, away from the residential core toward less visible terrain, toward the desert. This is where the investigation becomes more physical because once movement is established, search begins to follow it. Not broadly, precisely. Search teams do not move randomly. They move based on alignment, where digital data meets geographic possibility, where movement patterns make sense, and where time allows for travel. At this stage, investigators are not guessing where to look. They are narrowing it because distance matters. How far could someone travel in that time window? What routes are available? What areas provide concealment? Those questions are not theoretical. They are calculated. And those calculations guide everything that follows. At the same time, forensic work continues building its own layer. DNA remains central because it does something no other evidence can do. It places a person, not in theory, but physically. And once placement is established, everything else connects to it. But until profiles are fully separated, that placement remains incomplete, which is why this part of the investigation takes time. Because accuracy here matters more than speed. A single confirmed profile can change the entire case. Now step back and look at what exists at this point. A structured timeline, a controlled environment, evidence of preparation, digital patterns that repeat, movement that aligns, a location that matters, DNA that remains unresolved. This is no longer an open-ended investigation. It is a narrowing one. And narrowing leads to pressure. Because as possibilities decrease, focus increases. And when focus increases, the path forward becomes clearer. Not publicly, but internally. And that internal clarity is what leads to the next phase. Not speculation, action. But that action has not been announced, which means the case is still building, still being tested, still being refined. Because once that step is taken, everything must hold. Every timeline, every piece of evidence, every connection. And that is where this investigation stands. Closer than it was, more defined than before, but still incomplete. Because there is still one thing missing, the same thing that has been missing from the beginning, Nancy Guthrie herself. And until that changes, everything else remains part of a structure that is still moving toward its final point. There is a moment in every investigation where the question changes. Not publicly, not in the way people watching from the outside expect, but internally. Because in the beginning, investigators are trying to understand what happened. They collect everything. They follow everything. They move in every direction at once. But over time, something shifts. The investigation stops expanding, and it starts tightening. That is where the Nancy Guthrie case now sits. Not at the beginning, not even in the middle, but in the phase where everything that has been collected is being forced to agree. And that is the most important phase of all, because this is where cases are built for outcome, not theory, not possibility, outcome. By this point, the timeline has not changed. That matters more than anything else. Because in a case where there is no confirmed sighting after a certain point, time becomes the structure. 1:47 a.m., the camera goes offline. 2:28 a.m., the pacemaker stops transmitting. Those two timestamps are not estimates. They are not approximations. They are fixed, which means everything that happened fits inside that window. That is where investigators begin every reconstruction. Not by asking what might have happened, but by asking what could have happened within that time. Because time limits behavior, it limits movement, it limits distance, it limits decision M. And when behavior is limited, it becomes easier to understand. At the same time, something else has remained consistent. There was no forced entry. That detail has not changed, which removes an entire category of possibility, because forced entry creates evidence. It creates noise. It creates disruption. None of that is present here, which means whoever entered that home did not need to force their way in. That is not speculation. That is deduction. And deduction narrows the case faster than anything else. Now bring that together with what happened next. The camera did not fail randomly. It was accessed. That is what investigators believe based on system behavior, which means someone knew how to interact with it. Not guess, use. And that introduces something critical. Knowledge, not general knowledge, specific knowledge of that environment. That includes where cameras are placed, how they operate, how to interrupt them without triggering alarms. That level of understanding does not come from chance. It comes from exposure. Repeated exposure. Now step outside the house, because what happens outside becomes just as important as what happened inside the neighborhood. Catalina Foothills is not anonymous. It is structured, predictable, observed, which means unusual activity stands out, and that creates a problem for anyone trying to operate there unless they have a reason to be there. That is why the investigation focused so heavily on two specific elements: the nearby rental property and construction activity in the same area, because both provide something essential: cover. Not concealment, but legitimacy. The ability to exist in that space without raising suspicion. That is what makes those two elements important. Not because they prove anything, but because they explain how something could happen without being noticed. Now return to the timeline again. January 11th, January 24th, February 1st. 3 dates, not random, sequential. The first appearance, the second alignment, the final event. That is how investigators interpret them. Not as isolated incidents, but as a progression. Because when activity appears before an event, it suggests preparation. And preparation changes everything. Because preparation means intention, not reaction. Now combine that with digital evidence. Cell tower data does not create a story, it creates patterns. And those patterns are what investigators analyze. Which devices were present, which devices moved, which devices changed behavior, and most importantly, which devices did not behave normally. Devices that appear consistently in an area and then disappear during a critical window become significant not because they prove involvement but because they break pattern. And breaking pattern is what investigators look for. At the same time, movement data begins to align. Devices that were present near NY's home, moving away after the critical window, not randomly, in a direction, and that direction has been noted, away from the residential area, toward less visible terrain, toward the desert. Now this does not confirm what happened next, but it creates a path, and once a path exists, investigators follow it. Search efforts begin to align with that path. Not broadly, precisely because modern investigations do not rely on random searches. They rely on data-guided movement, and that is exactly what is happening here. At the same time, forensic work continues. DNA remains one of the most critical elements in this case, not because it is simple, but because it is not. Mixed samples, multiple contributors, which slows the process, but increases its value, because once those profiles are separated, they become definitive. They do not suggest, they identify, and when that happens, the case moves forward quickly. But until then, the process remains controlled, careful, because one mistaken interpretation can affect everything. Now step back and look at what exists at this point. A confirmed timeline, no forced entry, controlled access, evidence of preparation, digital patterns that repeat, movement that aligns, a location of interest, DNA that is unresolved but active. This is no longer an open-ended investigation. It is a structured one. And structured investigations move differently. They slow down not because nothing is happening, but because everything must be right. Because once action is taken, it must hold. Every detail, every connection, every conclusion. That is where this case is now. Closer than it was, more defined than before, but still incomplete. Because there is one question that remains. The same question that has been there from the beginning. Where is Nancy Guthrie? Because until that is answered, everything else remains part of an unfinished story. Before this ends, there is something more important than any analysis. If you have any information at all, no matter how small it seems, this is the moment to come forward. Call the FBI. 1800 call FBI 1800-2255-324. Submit a tip. https:/tips fbi.gov. Reward $11,000 total $1 million from the family plus $1,000 from the FBI. You can remain completely anonymous. You do not need to be certain. You do not need to have proof. Investigators build the case. You provide the detail. Because in cases like this, one detail can change everything. Nancy Guthrie is not a headline. She is a person. And this case is not over. Not until she is found. And until that happens, the investigation continues.